Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be bringing down the Monday, February 5th slate of college basketball DFS for DraftKings as well as FanDuel. We've got another big Monday slate where it's kind of like the oxymoron name because it's a very small slate. It's only two games. But hey, we've got two pretty good games, pretty compelling games that we can target here on DraftKings as well as FanDuel. So in this episode, we're going to break down both games, what you can expect from them, and who you need to be targeting for your DFS lineups from each of these two games. Now, I will go ahead and tell you in advance, probably not going to have an episode for Tuesday's college basketball slate. So if you want my thoughts on that, make sure you join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. Fantasy Corner Discord's got a lot of smart people who play DFS for a lot of different sports, and the college basketball chat in there is jumping. We've got a lot of smart people where we just kind of bounce ideas, talk lineups, talk strategy all day long, and it's a blast to be a part of. And sweating it out together, talking about the games in there is a blast. It's a great community to be a part of. And so if you want my thoughts on any slate that I don't have a video for, that is the place where you can get them. I'll be in there chatting it up all day long talking college basketball. But tomorrow on the podcast, I'm probably going to be talking golf because one of the best tournaments in golf is this week, the Waste Management Phoenix Open. So very much looking forward to that. And so basically, if you want, my thoughts on any slate I don't cover, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. But we will have a lot of slates covered from here on to the rest of college basketball season, all the way through the NCAA tournament. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to the channel as well as to the audio feed. That way you can be notified when new episodes drop and you never miss one. Also, while you're at it, if you like what we do here on Mike's Money Picks, please hit the like button for this video. Please also rate and review if you're listening to audio. I promise those do not fall on deaf ears, and they really do help out a ton. It helps the video get noticed on YouTube, helps the podcast, come up in searches, and I really do appreciate it when you guys do that. All right, so let's go ahead and end the introduction there because we've got two games to get to. So let's go ahead and start talking about game number one, a tilt in the ACC between Miami and Virginia. All right, so the tip-off to Monday night is going to be between Miami and Virginia. And anytime Virginia is on the slate, I feel like you can always just put like a big red X through that game and just kind of be okay with not playing the guys that are going up against Virginia. But hey, this time on a two-game slate, you kind of have to play somebody from this game. So this one is an interesting one. It is projected to be 68-64 in favor of Virginia. That line is according to KenPom. And this is the lower total game by 9 points. Kansas and Kansas State has a 9-point higher total than this one. And there's a very clear reason why, right? It's because of how Virginia plays. Virginia ranks 361st in the nation in tempo, and there's only 362 teams, and they rank 12th in defensive efficiency according to KenPom. So you are getting less possessions against an elite defensive team. That's not a good combination. Now, Miami is kind of a better team to target, though. They rank 82nd in the nation in tempo, and they rank 115th in the nation in defensive efficiency. So, for the Virginia guys, this is a big time pace up spot, and it's a spot against a pretty not great defense for ACC standards. So this is definitely an opportunity that Virginia can take advantage of in this spot. Now, I mentioned that this is the lower total by 9 points. Well, if you remember the Big Monday slate last week, we had a similar situation in the Texas-Houston game where Texas and Houston had the lower total quite significantly, if I remember correctly. But that game ended up actually going a little bit higher than expected. The Duke-Virginia Tech game ended up going a little lower than expected, and Texas and Houston ended up playing overtime as well. So it was a great combination where if you went with a contrarian stack and stacked up the Texas and Houston game, your lineup probably won. So here on a two-game slate, I'm not going to sit here and poo-poo any ideas and say that you can't stack up this game or say that it's wiser to stack up the Kansas State game. But, I think either strategy can be successful. We don't know exactly how the games are going to play out. We know what the most likely outcome is, but we don't always know it. And so if you want to be contrarian and stack this game up, I do think there are some options to do so because I do think there are some matchups that can be taken advantage of on both sides. So let's dive into that. So Miami had a new starting five in their most recent game against who did they play most recently? Virginia Tech. How did I forget that one? Because Sean Padula was one of my guys. So they went with a new starting five in that game. They had previously run out this starting five, but I believe Matthew Cleveland left early the last time this unit started. But their starting five was Pack, Poplar, Cleveland, George, and Omier was the new starting five. They moved Bensley Joseph to the bench. Now, what that did for Joseph, though, it didn't really see him see that much of a downturn in what he normally does. He played 21 minutes, which is significantly lower than what he'd normally seen, but he had an 18% usage rate, which is about on par with what he sees, for season-long averages, and he put up 21 fantasy points, which is not terrible. It's not what you want from a guy at $5,700. So what definitely concerns me, though, is that he was really efficient in this game. He was 5 for 7 from the field. So Bensley Joseph, in a game where, he was playing in this new role, played significantly less minutes, about a third less of the minutes, and still managed to put up about the same amount of fantasy points because he was efficient. I think that's kind of a red flag, and he's a guy that I'm not going to be going out of my way to target. I think he would be pretty much dependent on like Nigel Pack or Matthew Cleveland getting in foul trouble if he wants to hit value. Now, after Joseph, though, what you did see was Keyshawn George was a guy that moved into the starting lineup, but he had been kind of already starting because Matthew Cleveland was injured and he was starting in place of Matthew Cleveland, but George has been a bench player for the majority of the season. Now, George is a very versatile piece. He played a lot of minutes at the 4 in that game against Virginia Tech. Even there was like a very brief situation where he was in at the 5. And so I definitely think that he's a guy that's going to see a ton of minutes. Like I've been impressed with this guy when I've watched him just based off the eye test. In that Virginia Tech game, he played 34 minutes, which is quite a lot. Had a 20% usage rate. Ended up with 35 fantasy points. But the only slight red flag was that he did have 5 combined blocks and steals. That's 10 fantasy points. So you take those away and points, rebounds, and assists, he still ended up with 25 fantasy points, which is not bad, especially a guy at his salary. But the pace down game against Virginia does worry me a little bit. But I don't think he's going anywhere. Like I think on this slate, the 6K range is kind of tough. And I think that he's one of the better options in that 6K range, in my opinion. Now, the guy I would prefer to George, though, is $100 more expensive. It's Matthew Cleveland. He was back from injury in that game against Virginia Tech, and he had not really been super consistent before then. You know, he left the Notre Dame game early. Florida State, he was held to only 8 fantasy points in a revenge game. But against Virginia Tech, he looked great. He played 33 minutes, ended up putting up 31.75 fantasy points with a double-double, 15 and 13. And so I really like this spot for Cleveland. I think that right now you are getting him at a low price tag from what he really is. You know, in that game, he had a 24% usage rate, which is higher than his season average. So this new starting lineup could be good news for Matthew Cleveland if it allows Keyshawn George to play the 4 and Cleveland to play the 3. I think that's something that is kind of yet to be seen if that's going to really pan itself out. But just based off of game 1, it definitely seems like it helped Matthew Cleveland, and he's one of my favorite options on this slate in general. Now, what that lineup did with Bensley Joseph being on the bench was more the usage shifted to Nigel Pack because he was used as an on-ball point guard more. He played 35 minutes in the Virginia Tech game, took 15 shots, which led the team, but he only put up 19.75 fantasy points. But he had a 27% usage rate. And so I kind of think Nigel Pack is a sneaky little play where I think the game log watchers aren't going to know that like he actually had a lot of usage and had a lot of opportunities in that Virginia Tech game. Like, you know, he was 4 for 15. What if he just goes 7 for 15? There's an instant, 6 or 7 more fantasy points and it looks a whole lot better. So I definitely think he's a pretty solid option as well. And, with all these Miami guys, the pace down spot against Virginia concerns me a little bit, but on 2-game slate, you don't really have a whole lot of options. So, Pack and Cleveland, I definitely love the fact that they got boosted usage from that new starting lineup. Now, the guy that we got to talk about always whenever Miami's on the slate is Norchad Omier. He is a 6'7" center that is just an absolute pit bull down in the paint. He is just incredibly strong and a great rebounder. He dealt with foul trouble in that game against Virginia Tech, and it was kind of like a floor game, right? He only played 26 minutes. He only got up 7 shots. He only put up 28.75 fantasy points, and that's the low that you're getting out of him. Virginia has been very consistent at the 5 spot, and Virginia does not draw a lot of fouls at all. So I'm not concerned about Omier getting in foul trouble. And I think that he's a pretty solid option on this slate. But I will say, though, there's another high-priced forward who I would rather play than Norchad Omier, but I still think he's a pretty solid option in this situation. Now, I wouldn't touch anybody outside of these 6 guys. I think that Nwoko would play more minutes if Omier were to get in foul trouble, but he only played 5 minutes against Virginia Tech, didn't really do anything with it either. So I think unless we get some late breaking injury news that one of those top 6 is out, just stick with those top 6 for Miami. They were the only ones that played more than 20 minutes in that game against Virginia Tech. Now, talking about Virginia, they are now pretty much playing a 7-man rotation, which makes things a little bit easier. The head of that rotation, though, is Reese Beekman. He is their best player. He is their highest usage player, and he is the second highest assist rate in the country, which is good news because Miami gives up one of the highest assist rates in the country. Last week, there was a similar situation with this with Pop Isaacs taking on TCU, where Pop Isaacs had a high assist rate. TCU gave up a high assist rate. Boom, he had a ceiling game right after it. So I'm not saying that Reese Beekman is necessarily in for a ceiling game, but I think that the opportunity and the chance is there for him only at a salary of $8,300, which is very reasonable for a guy with his usage rate and assist rates to have a ceiling game against this Miami team. I like Reese Beekman a lot on this slate. Now, Jordan Minor is the guy that we got to talk about for Virginia, though. He slotted into the starting center role for Virginia in the game against Wake Forest, which was 7 games ago. And since then, he has been over 18 fantasy points in 5 of 7 games, which is pretty good. And he's seen a 19% usage rate in 5 of 7 games, which is more than his season long average. So he's a guy that he's out there. He's playing a lot of minutes. He's been generally pretty good. The Louisville game, he found himself in some foul trouble, but if he can stay out of foul trouble, then he's probably going to have a pretty good game. The only thing that concerns me is Omier has a way of getting guys in foul trouble. And so I think that, let me think the best way to say this. For his role, he's very reasonably priced at $5,400. However, the potential foul trouble against Omier concerns me a little bit. I probably would not play Omier and Minor together in the same lineup because I just don't think those two guys would be very correlated on this slate. Now, since Minor's emergence, Ryan Dunn has seen his usage drop significantly. Ryan Dunn was a guard that was playing the small ball 5 a lot of minutes for Virginia previously to Jordan Minor ended up starting. And so what you've seen from Ryan Dunn is he's had a few ceiling games. Like there's been 7 games with Minor starting at center. And Ryan Dunn has 3 games of 30 fantasy points or more, 2 of which were 39 fantasy points or more. But he's also had 4 games of 20 fantasy points or less. So ask yourself, what's more likely to happen, 3 out of 7 or 4 out of 7? My opinion is the 4 out of 7 because even in those games where he had ceiling games, he was very efficient from the field, and he was able to get a double-double thanks to overtime against NC State, thanks to Georgia Tech and Louisville being terrible rebounding teams. So I just don't think there's a very big likelihood for Ryan Dunn to have a ceiling game here against Miami in a situation where he hasn't excelled since Minor has been in the starting lineup. McNeely is a guy we got to talk about too. He's the secondary ball handler after Reese Beekman. If there were ever be a game where Reese Beekman gets in foul trouble or gets hurt, I think you would immediately see a ceiling game from Isaac McNeely. He is second on the team in shot rate. He actually almost shoots as much as Reese Beekman does, and I think he's a pretty solid pivot play off of Beekman. But I think you can also pair Beekman with him because if Beekman is getting a lot of assists, it's probably going to be going to the guy who's taking a lot of shots. So I think he's a very solid stacking partner with Beekman or contrarian play off of Reese Beekman. Now, after that, Rhodey, Graves, and Buchanan, we'll see a little bit of minutes. They're out there that they're going to play, but I don't know. I'm not really confident in any of them at all. Groves probably has the highest upside because he has the highest usage rate when he's on the floor. In back-to-back games, he's put up 32 and 25 fantasy points against Clemson and Notre Dame. He's taken a combined 19 shots in those 2 games on a combined 40 minutes. And I don't necessarily know if that's going to continue, but I think that at $4,500, he's worth a shot in some lineups. Like I've said this about a lot of guys so far this season. If you're playing 20 lineups in GPPs, he's got to make your lineup pull one of them because if there's a chance that he goes off, you're going to need him in your lineup. And out of all the guys that are 5K and below here on this slate, he probably has the highest ceiling, but I'm not sold on it being a ceiling game. Next up, we do have Kansas State taking on Kansas. Fortunately for Kansas State, this one is in the friendly confines of Manhattan as opposed to Phog Allen Fieldhouse because it looks like it's going to be very tough to win at the Phog. KenPom has this game projected to be 73-68 in favor of Kansas, giving it the highest total by 9 points, making Kansas the highest implied team total of the slate, and Kansas State second on the slate in team total, tied for second with Virginia. So, in this one, there's a little bit better matchup of tempos. Kansas State ranks 231st in tempo, which is not great. They're not a good offensive team ranking outside the top 100, but they are 26th in defensive efficiency. Kansas is top 20 on both sides of the ball in offensive and defensive efficiency, and they're 106 in tempo. So this is definitely a little bit of a better game environment on paper than the first one. But like I said, in a 2-game slate, I think if you're making a lot of lineups, you can stack either of these games or go balanced. I think that it's too difficult to determine just 100% what's going to happen between these 2 games. Now, on the Kansas side, this is a team where they are incredibly concentrated with their starting 5. Their bench players, Jackson, Timberlake, and Braun, played a combined 22 minutes, and took a combined 2 shots in their last game against Houston. So Jackson, Timberlake, and Braun, they're going to play a little bit, but they're not going to play a lot. They're not going to shoot the ball a lot. And I don't necessarily think you can go to this Kansas team for value plays, which really makes it tough. There's not a whole lot of value to be had on this slate at all, which is why I think a lot of people are going to play Jake Rose at Virginia. Now, we do, whenever Kansas is on the slate, have to talk about Hunter Dickinson. In my opinion, he is the top play on the slate. I would play him over Norchad Omier. That's just me. He has a 25% usage rate and 29% shot rate on the season with a combined 37% rebounding rate. That is just elite. He's taken 14 shots or more in each of the last 3 games. He's had at least 36 fantasy points in each of the last 3 games. And Kansas State's front court, more on them later, but I don't think they're built to stop Dickinson. I see him having his way with this front court and see him having a ceiling game. That's just how I see it. Now, Kevin McCullough is a guy that we got to talk about next, and we're going to talk about Johnny Furphy too. So McCullough has only gone for 5x value once since Johnny Furphy entered the starting lineup. Furphy is a great rebounder, and one thing that McCullough kind of is dependent on is his peripheral stats to make him reach, value because he's an incredibly high price tag. And so McCullough, I think, is a guy that he probably has less upside than like a Beekman or a Dickinson. But I think if you're looking to game stack this game, he's a guy that I would make sure is in my game stack because he is a guy who loves to put up peripheral stats and is at his best when the game gets going up and down, like against Cincinnati when he put up 40 fantasy points. Now, Furphy is the guy that I said we got to talk about, right? He's played in, I believe it is 7 games, if my count is correct. Yes, 7 games in the starting lineup. And in those 7 games, on DraftKings, you see his average for fantasy points per game. It says 16.9. Throw that out the window. His role completely changed 7 games ago. And since he's been in the starting lineup, he's averaging 28.4 fantasy points, which sounds really good, but now he's really expensive. He's up to $7,500. And I just don't think I'm going to get to him at that price tag because he doesn't do it on a whole lot of usage. Even after entering the starting lineup, he's attempted more than 8 shots in a game only once. Like, he doesn't reach these fantasy point totals on a lot of usage. He reaches it on efficiency and on rebounding. And I don't know. I don't think he's going to continue to keep shooting like 70% from the field and 50% from 3. Like, I just don't think he's going to be able to sustain that. And so if he's not going to sustain his great, shooting efficiency, then he's going to have to find a way to put up stats elsewhere, or he's going to have to put up more shots. And I just don't see that being the case. Like, he's a really solid player, but his pathway for fantasy points is very narrow at a salary of only $7,500. I would probably not be playing a whole lot of Furphy in this game. Now, KJ Adams, we do got to talk about as well. He's hit 4x value in 4 out of 7 games with Furphy in the lineup. So, even though Furphy's rebounding has definitely taken a little bit away from Adams, Adams' scoring has still been there. Like Furphy, though, he gets there on not a whole lot of usage. I think he's kind of a contrarian play off of Dickinson. Like, if there were a game where Dickinson were to get doubled or if Dickinson were to get in foul trouble, I think that is when you would see KJ Adams have his best. So I would probably be playing him in lineups that I'm not playing Hunter Dickinson. DeJuan Harris is a guy that, quite frankly, I think I've played him once this season. I don't play him a lot at all. He doesn't shoot the ball ever. And because of that, he generally caps his own upside in fantasy. It's really hard to get 30 and 40 fantasy point totals when you're not scoring 20 plus points because you can only get so many rebounds and assists, right? And so you look at his game log over the course of the season, he's only had a ceiling of 28.75 fantasy points, which he did against Oklahoma State where he got 9 shots. So, a ceiling of 4.5x is not exactly what we're looking for. If he were priced in the 5K range, I would love him, but it's $6,200. I'm just not a fan. If I'm attacking this Kansas side, it's probably going to be Dickinson as a lone wolf, or maybe Dickinson McCullough or Dickinson Furphy, or Adams McCullough, Adams Furphy. But I'm definitely not touching the bench. I'm probably not touching DeJuan Harris either. Now, on the Kansas State side, they switched up their starting lineup against Oklahoma State, and it changed things around dramatically. They started Day Ames at point, Tyler Perry at the 2, Cam Carter at the 3, Arthur Kaluma at the 4, and then Jarrell Colbert at the 5. David N'Guessan is really the only injury news you need to monitor for this slate. He came off the bench and was hurt in that game and played hurt and only played 13 minutes. I don't think he's going to play this one just from how everything sounds. But even if he does, I don't think you can rely on him to play a full minute load. And going up against Hunter Dickinson is just a tough matchup for N'Guessan, who's only 6'9". And then Jarrell Colbert was the guy that started at the center in place of N'Guessan. But he played 16 minutes, put up 4 shots, 6.5 fantasy points. Again, another guy that I see having a lot of difficulty guarding Hunter Dickinson. Will McNair is probably the best matchup for him. But Will McNair loves to foul is his problem. Will McNair played 25 minutes in that game against Oklahoma State. Well, 24 and change, and ended up putting up 24.75 fantasy points. That's a pretty good number, but like he's really going to have to bring his game against Hunter Dickinson. Like, and he's going to have to stay out of foul trouble, which means that he might not be playing as physically on the defense and on the boards. And so I think you can avoid Kansas State bigs altogether. Now, the guy that I do think that should set up well for is Arthur Kaluma. Like, I thought moving him to the 4 would be really good for him, but he only put up 25.25 fantasy points, but he did take 11 shots against Oklahoma State. So maybe there's a little bit of upside there. He did have a 21% usage rate in that game. I think he is a more natural 4 because he's not an elite shooter. And so maybe that might free him up just a little bit. Going up against KJ Adams might help him with a little bit of rebounding because he'll be closer to the basket. I don't know. Maybe there's something there with Kaluma. Maybe there's not. But I do think moving him to the 4 long term will be good for his fantasy prospects. Now, Cam Carter did have 36 fantasy points in that game against Oklahoma State, but the 3 steals really helped him out a lot. And I don't think you can rely on getting those 3 steals against Kansas. The guy I would prefer to play on this Kansas State side would be Tyler Perry. He led the team in shots, led the team in usage, put up 28.75 fantasy points against Oklahoma State. He's taken a combined 31 shots in the last 2 games. I think he's their best offensive player, and I think if they want to chance it, hanging close with Kansas, he's going to have to be the one that does it. And he's at a very reasonable salary at only $6,400. And we've seen him at this season be in the 8K range and 7K range most of the year. He's had 40 fantasy point performances, so I really do like Tyler Perry. He's probably going to be the guy on this Kansas State side that I have the most of. Ames and Finister are going to kind of switch minutes split minutes at the off guard spot. Ames played 15 minutes against Oklahoma State, put up a 1 rebound, 1 fantasy point total. Finister played better, played 16 minutes, put up 10.5 fantasy points, but I don't know. I probably wouldn't play either of these guys. I think maybe as a game stacking piece, you could go Finister, but I think you can avoid that situation altogether as well. So this game, while it has the higher total, really doesn't have a whole lot of guys that I'm too eager to play, which makes it a really tough game stack, or maybe just a really narrow game stack where I make it like a 2-2 or a 3-2. But it definitely is going to be a tough game to target, and you don't like to see when the higher game on the slate has value plays that are not good, because generally speaking, better value plays tend to come from better game environments. All right, so that does it for the 2-game breakdowns. If you like what you saw here in this video, please hit the like button. If you listen on audio, please rate and review. It really does help me out a lot. And while you're at it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that way you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season. Now, if you do want more information from me, there are a few places you can get it. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. If there's ever any updates for the show, I will tweet it out. I'm also more than happy to answer any lineup or start sit questions on there. And I do try to tweet out the DFS rundown for the college basketball slates. I've been a little bit hit or miss on those lately, just because having a 5-month-old daughter, sometimes you end up not at your phone for a few minutes because you're having to keep her entertained. So I can be hit or miss with the rundowns, but I do tweet out the show updates, and I am more than happy to answer any questions you have on Twitter. Also, I mentioned it earlier, but join the Fantasy Corner Discord. It's entirely free. It's a great community to play DFS and talk about DFS in, and I'm super glad to be a part of it, and everybody that joins, just super glad to have them in there, and really look forward to each and every day chatting it up in there, talking plays, talking lineups, and sweating it out together. So if you're looking for people to talk about DFS with, or just looking to get better at DFS, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. Lastly, I do write a full article for my Patreon every single college basketball slate where I profile my core plays, as well as kind of my lineup strategy and attack strategy for the slate. If you want to know from everybody in this video who actually is making my lineups, that is the place where you can find that out at. Now, also, I'm not going to sit here and guarantee that you can just instantly plug in all those guys and immediately win GPPs. It's not that easy, but I do think that I provide a lot of good information, a lot of sound strategy and sound advice that you can use to start building your lineups and start building your own process and get better at college basketball DFS. And there's not a whole lot of people out there that do that. I will say pretty much for the last week, the Friday night core was pretty doggone good, and the core for the Sunday slate was pretty doggone good as well. So, I don't bat 1,000. Nobody does, but I do think I give good information that can help you get better at your own process in DFS. All right, so that does it for the Big Monday episode. Remember, I'll probably not be having an episode for the Tuesday slate because I'm going to be talking golf here on the channel tomorrow night. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. That way you can be back with us when we are back here talking college basketball. And I look forward to having you back then. Best of luck to everybody on the Monday night slate. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you next time.